I'm about to tell you a story that's as disturbing as it is fascinating. It's dark. It's unsettling. And honestly, it's far worse than that. This is the story of how science, something meant to improve human life, was twisted into a tool for some of history's most horrifying crimes. Science itself wasn't the villain. The real villains were the people who used it to justify their own cruel ambitions. Without wasting any time, let's dive in. We're talking about eugenics. And once you start following this thread, it leads to evolution, social Darwinism, concentration camps, Adolf Hitler, and a time when the idea of a superior race wasn't considered fringe. It was accepted by governments, universities, and respected institutions around the world. So if you're settling in for this one, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's start at the beginning. Before we can understand the story, we need to understand what eugenics actually is. At its core, eugenics is the belief that humanity can be improved by controlling who is allowed to reproduce. The goal is supposedly to improve the quality of human genetics. The idea might sound familiar because selective breeding has been used with animals for centuries. Certain dog breeds are intentionally crossed to produce specific traits, and livestock are bred to maximize strength, size, or productivity. Now, imagine someone applying that same logic to human beings. Imagine deciding that certain people shouldn't have children because they're considered unfit. Or worse, deciding they shouldn't be allowed to live at all. That's eugenics. You can probably already think of historical figures and events connected to this idea, and we'll get there. But first, we need to travel much further back, to ancient Greece nearly 2,400 years ago. One of the earliest philosophers to express ideas resembling eugenics was Plato. While he didn't advocate eugenics in the modern sense, he argued that the state should encourage healthy and physically capable people to have more children. Over the centuries, many rulers took ideas like these and pushed them to terrifying extremes. If stronger people should reproduce more, they reasoned, why not eliminate the weak altogether? Some civilizations adopted similar practices independently of Plato's philosophy. Sparta is one of the best-known examples. If you've ever seen movies about ancient Sparta, you may remember the stories. Newborns judged too weak or unhealthy were abandoned, while only the strongest were expected to survive. The Romans also embraced versions of this thinking at different points in their history. Their goal was simple: build what they believed would be a stronger society. But these ideas didn't become a formal scientific theory until the late 1800s. The man who transformed them into a movement was Francis Galton. And here's where things take an unexpected turn. Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin. Yes, Darwin's own cousin. It gets even stranger. The intellectual foundation Galton used came from Darwin's theory of evolution. That's why, in a very indirect way, some people trace the origins of later atrocities back to ideas inspired by Darwin's work, even though Darwin himself argued for something entirely different. When people talk about evolution, they often summarize it as survival of the fittest. But Darwin wasn't saying that the strongest always survive. His point was that the organisms best adapted to their environment are the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. Adaptability, not raw strength, is what matters. Galton took that concept and completely changed its meaning. He asked himself, if nature can select, why can't humans do it faster? Instead of waiting for natural selection, why not create an artificial one? Prevent people labeled as weak from having children. Allow only those considered desirable to reproduce. Within a few generations, humanity could supposedly be transformed. To Galton, it sounded like accelerated evolution. Darwin strongly disagreed. He believed Galton had fundamentally misunderstood his work. Evolution, Darwin argued, was a natural process, not something governments or institutions should manipulate. He rejected the idea that any authority had the right to decide whose lives were more valuable than others, or who deserved the opportunity to have a family. He defended that position for the rest of his life. Galton, however, continued promoting his ideas. In fact, it wasn't until after Darwin died in 1882 that Galton formally introduced the term eugenics. Just 1 year later, In 1883, he published the work that gave the movement its name. The word itself comes from the Greek roots meaning well-born or good birth. During the early decades of the 20th century, these ideas found fertile ground in the United States. Eugenics wasn't some fringe movement operating in secret. No. It received public funding, attracted support from prominent academics, and even led to the creation of government-backed eugenics organizations. But before we get to Nazi Germany, it's worth looking at what was happening in America first. Francis Galton, the British scientist who had been knighted for his work in several fields, became best known for this single idea. His dream was to engineer what he believed would be a genetically superior population in Britain. As shocking as that sounds today, his ideas were about to spread much farther than he ever imagined. Galton's vision never gained widespread support in Britain. But elsewhere, it would shape policies that affected the lives of millions in ways almost impossible to imagine today. One of the earliest examples appeared in the United States. In 1896, Connecticut passed a law prohibiting people diagnosed with epilepsy or certain mental illnesses from getting married. The idea was simple. If these individuals couldn't marry, they couldn't have children, and the traits lawmakers considered undesirable would gradually disappear. The movement quickly gained momentum. By the early 1900s, organizations dedicated to controlling reproduction had begun influencing public policy. Then, in 1911, another major step was taken with the creation of an organization focused on improving what it called the nation's genetic stock. One of the people associated with this effort was John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, the same John Harvey Kellogg, whose name later became famous through the breakfast cereal company. Long before becoming a household name in nutrition and business, Kellogg was an outspoken supporter of eugenics. Under initiatives like these, national conferences were held throughout the 1910s and 1920s, helping transform eugenics from an academic theory into a coordinated public movement. To organize the effort even further, eugenics record offices were established across the country. These offices collected detailed family histories, tracked inherited traits, and attempted to identify which families were considered desirable and which were not. Reports produced from this data labeled certain groups as genetically inferior or socially unfit. Not surprisingly, those labels fell overwhelmingly on immigrants, racial minorities, poor families, and people with disabilities. Beginning in 1909, California became the center of one of the most aggressive sterilization programs in the United States. State institutions were authorized to sterilize people against their will if officials believed they were mentally ill, intellectually disabled, or otherwise unfit to reproduce. Over the following decades, thousands of people underwent these procedures without their consent. Supporters argued that they were protecting future generations from inherited diseases and reducing the burden on society. In reality, the policies disproportionately targeted minority communities and other vulnerable populations. What began in California eventually spread. Similar sterilization laws were adopted in dozens of states, with government-appointed officials deciding who was considered fit or unfit to have children. Then, in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court issued one of the most controversial decisions in its history. In Buck v. E. Bell, the court ruled that forced sterilization laws did not violate the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., writing for the majority, ended the opinion with one of the most infamous lines ever written by an American judge: "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Today, that statement is widely condemned. But at the time, it reflected how deeply eugenic thinking had become embedded in American institutions. Politicians often defended these policies as practical solutions to poverty, crime, economic hardship, or public health. Yet beneath those arguments was another motive that many historians have documented: preserving what advocates believed to be a genetically superior white population by limiting reproduction among groups they considered undesirable. The consequences reached far beyond state hospitals. A federal investigation published in the 1970s found that between 1970 and 1976, an estimated 25 to 50% of Native American women were sterilized, many without fully informed consent. In numerous cases, sterilization procedures were performed during unrelated surgeries, leaving patients unaware of what had happened until much later. Some accounts were even more disturbing. Women were reportedly pressured into consenting to sterilization before their children could receive medical treatment. Refusing could mean risking access to life-saving care. These events unfolded not in some distant dictatorship, but in the United States, a country that has long presented itself as a global champion of liberty and individual rights. And America's eugenics movement did not remain within its own borders. Versions of these policies appeared in countries including Canada, Australia, Brazil, Japan, China, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, France, Switzerland, Estonia, and several others. But nowhere did eugenics become more systematic, or more catastrophic, than in Nazi Germany. To understand how the Holocaust became possible, it's important to recognize one uncomfortable fact. American eugenics heavily influenced Nazi racial policy. Hitler openly praised aspects of American immigration restrictions and sterilization programs in Mein Kampf. He also admired the militaristic ideals of ancient Sparta, where only the strongest were expected to survive. The exchange of ideas wasn't one-sided either. Throughout the 1930s, researchers connected to California's eugenics institutions shared studies, publications, and data with scientists in Germany. German researchers closely followed American sterilization laws as they developed their own racial policies. One of Germany's leading research centers in this field was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, where scientists conducted research on genetics, anthropology, and racial theory. And here's another surprising connection. The institute received substantial financial support from the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States. Yes, the Rockefeller Foundation? The connections don't end there. You've probably heard the name Joseph Mengele, the SS physician who became infamous as the angel of death at Auschwitz. Before carrying out the horrific experiments that made him one of history's most notorious war criminals, Mengele worked within Germany's academic research system, where projects connected to human genetics and racial science had received funding from organizations that included the Rockefeller Foundation. Those years gave him scientific training and professional connections long before he arrived at Auschwitz and began committing the atrocities for which he would become infamous. Connections. Everywhere you look, the connections keep appearing. Hitler's deep commitment to eugenics took shape during one of the most important periods of his life, his imprisonment at Landsberg prison. In 1923, Hitler and the Nazi Party attempted to overthrow the German government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed. Hitler was wounded while fleeing, captured shortly afterward, and convicted of high treason. Although he received a 5-year sentence, he served only about 9 months. Those months changed everything. While in prison, Hitler concluded that seizing power through violence had failed. If he wanted to rule Germany, he would have to win public support first. During that time, he began refining the propaganda strategy that would eventually carry the Nazi Party to power. He also wrote Mein Kampf, the book that laid out his political ideology. At its core were ideas about racial purity, selective breeding, and the belief that Germany could be strengthened by eliminating those he considered biologically inferior. Hitler even drafted a second book that was never published during his lifetime. In it, he praised ancient Sparta, arguing that the Spartans' treatment of children they considered weak was, in his view, more humane than modern birth control or abortion, because it preserved what he believed to be the strength of future generations. After leaving prison, Hitler spent years spreading these ideas through speeches, rallies, and relentless propaganda. He convinced millions of Germans that they belonged to a superior race and that the nation's future depended on protecting its genetic purity. When the Nazis came to power, those ideas quickly became government policy. In 1933, Germany passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. Under this law, special hereditary health courts determined which people were considered genetically unfit to have children. Physicians were required to report patients who fell into the government's categories, and doctors who refused faced serious legal consequences. Over the following years, roughly 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized. But even that wasn't enough for the Nazi regime. Officials eventually concluded that sterilization was too slow. If their goal was complete racial purification, they believed there was a faster solution. That led to the creation of facilities such as the Hartheim Euthanasia Center and other institutions connected to what became known as the Action T4 program. The word euthanasia can be misleading here. These were not voluntary medical decisions. People with mental illnesses, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, or hereditary conditions were systematically murdered without their consent. An estimated 200,000 people lost their lives through these so-called euthanasia programs. Before the Nazis built the extermination camps and gas chambers that became synonymous with the Holocaust, they had already developed mobile killing methods. Victims were loaded into sealed vehicles where engine exhaust was pumped inside, turning the vehicles into moving gas chambers. What followed is the chapter of history the world knows all too well. Concentration camps, gas chambers, medical experiments, mass executions. Millions of men, women, and children murdered simply because the state declared their lives unworthy. To convince ordinary Germans that these policies were justified, Nazi propaganda repeated the same message over and over again. Why should healthy, productive citizens sacrifice for a nation that also had to care for people the regime labeled as weak, disabled, or unfit? Perhaps the most disturbing part is that many people believed these policies were backed by legitimate science. Because eugenics had been presented as a scientific discipline, and because its supporters often claimed inspiration from evolutionary theory, countless citizens accepted it as rational, modern, and even progressive. But this raises an important question. From a purely scientific perspective, is it actually possible to influence the genetic makeup of future generations? The answer is yes. In principle, selective breeding and genetic selection can change the frequency of certain inherited traits over time. Science doesn't decide whether something is morally right or wrong. It simply asks whether something is possible and how it works. That's where an entirely different question enters the conversation. Ethics. The fact that something can be done does not mean it should be done. The history of nuclear physics illustrates this perfectly. Understanding the atom led to extraordinary breakthroughs in medicine, energy, and technology. The very same scientific knowledge also made nuclear weapons possible, resulting in unimaginable destruction and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. We don't blame physics itself for that. The responsibility lies in how people choose to use scientific knowledge. The same principle applies to eugenics. The science behind genetics is real. The moral choices made in its name are something entirely different. After World War II, the openly coercive eugenics programs that had shocked the world largely disappeared. But the underlying questions never completely went away. In the 21st century, they have re-emerged in new forms through advances in genetic engineering, reproductive technology, and gene editing. The language has changed, yet debates about genetics, heredity, and human potential continue to spark controversy. For example, Harvard psychologist Richard Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray argued in their controversial book, The Bell Curve, that differences in intelligence are influenced substantially by heredity. They further suggested that if people with lower measured IQs have higher birth rates, the average cognitive ability of society could gradually decline over time, bringing with it higher levels of poverty, unemployment, and crime. Those claims have been the subject of intense criticism for decades. Many researchers argue that the book oversimplifies the complex relationship between genetics, education, environment, socioeconomic conditions, and human intelligence. The debate surrounding those ideas remains one of the most controversial in modern social science. They went even further, arguing that differences in intelligence don't exist only between individuals or social classes, but also between racial groups. According to their interpretation, East Asian populations scored highest on intelligence tests, followed by Europeans, while people of African ancestry ranked lower on average. They also claim that poverty is largely the result of lower intelligence rather than social or economic circumstances, arguing that government welfare programs are ineffective and that higher birth rates among poor communities would gradually increase the proportion of people with lower cognitive ability. Whether those conclusions are scientifically valid has been fiercely debated for decades. Many researchers have challenged both the methodology and the assumptions behind these arguments, pointing to the enormous influence of education, environment, nutrition, discrimination, and socioeconomic conditions on human development. But this is where an important distinction has to be made. Science can investigate patterns, collect data, and propose hypotheses. It cannot tell us how human beings ought to treat one another. That's the role of ethics. Without ethical principles, it's frighteningly easy to see how scientific claims, whether accurate, incomplete, or entirely mistaken, can be transformed into political ideology. History has already shown us where that road can lead. Fortunately, countless scientists have pushed back against this way of thinking. One of the most influential critics was evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin, author of Biology as Ideology. Lewontin argued that scientists do not operate in a vacuum. They are members of families, societies, cultures, and political systems, and those experiences inevitably shape the questions they ask and the way they interpret evidence. He warned that science, like any powerful institution, can sometimes reflect the dominant values of the society around it, instead of remaining completely objective. That's why scientific knowledge must always be examined critically, especially when it's being used to justify policies that affect millions of people's lives. In other words, you can't completely separate science from society, and you can't separate society from science. Science doesn't belong to one nation, one race, or one political ideology. Knowledge belongs to humanity. And when it's guided by curiosity, humility, and ethical responsibility, it has the power to improve all of our lives. This video is really just the beginning of a much bigger conversation. There are still so many questions worth exploring: genetic engineering, the Human Genome Project, CRISPR gene editing, and the ethical dilemmas created by technologies that could one day reshape the human species itself. The history of eugenics may belong to the past, but the choices we'll make about genetics belong to the future. And that's exactly where we're headed next. As always, thank you for watching. I truly appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in the next one.